Now, from Atlanta News First, the issues that matter to you. This is On the Record.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
On Tuesday, the president delivered his State of the Union. The applause lines have faded, the cable chyrons are gone, the spin rooms are quiet, and now the real question, did any of it matter? I'm Rick Fulbaum here along with my colleague Doug Reardon. Thanks so much for joining us here on ANF Plus. We are the hosts of Atlanta News First on the Record. And over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about the president's speech. Not the highlights, you probably have already seen them. We're going to talk about the things that really matter at this point. The numbers. What has the reaction been like? What are voters saying about this? And what does it mean as we head into the November midterm elections, which are very, very important, of course. So, Doug, let's get started here, because if you look at some of the approval ratings for this president heading into the speech and over the last couple of weeks, he really entered the room, the chamber, with an uphill climb because voters are really, according to the polls, and this is not just one poll, this is all polls for the most part, from you name it, NPR to Fox News, show that the president's approval numbers are underwater. And even on the issues that helped him win re-election, immigration and the economy, voters are just not liking what they're seeing from this president.
Right. And when you talk about those approval rating numbers, they're the lowest that Trump has ever seen. So by most standards, we're seeing him at around 36% job approval, which for any president is not great. And I will point out, as our political expert, Dr. Bette Taylor, did the night of that speech, that it's even worse among independent voters. You have only about 27% of independent voters that think he's doing a good job, and only about 25% of them think he's paying attention to the most important issue the way he should be, which is the economy. And so that was what Trump ran on. And I think he did a really good job running on the economy, saying, I'm going to come in and I'm going to fix this and I'm going to fix that. And while we are seeing some pretty steady job numbers and some pretty low inflation numbers compared to what we've seen in the past 4 or 5 years, he can't run on it anymore. He has to actually have some action behind his words now. And I think that was what we're lacking for a lot of people, not only in that speech, but in his policies as well. Big blow to the Trump administration. About 4 days before that speech came, it was the tariff decision from the Supreme Court, and he really gave it to sort of the Supreme Court justices who are sitting just a couple of feet away from him that night. That was really the cornerstone of his economic policy, and something that he thought would be kind of the key in the lock for everything he promised voters on the economy. It's not panned out that way. We've talked to a lot of business owners. We're very upset by the way tariffs have impacted their workflow and their supply chains. Certainly, even out at the Trump rally in Rome, we talked to one woman who was a florist and said, I had the worst Valentine's Day that I've ever had in my 20 years of doing this. And she was wearing a red MAGA hat. So, this is affecting all people. And I think what he failed to do was kind of put some teeth to the policies he's been talking about and show voters how they actually are impacting their lives in a positive way. Because I think the most people, they're not feeling positivity out of these, out of these policies. And so I think what was the most important thing to come out of that speech was what was not said, and that was the president really addressing some of the positive impacts of his economic policies.
And we've seen this with other presidents over the years, sort of a disconnect between what the president is saying and what the electorate is feeling. And that seems to be what happened the other night, because while Americans, like those that you have just cited, are talking about the hardships that they are still facing when it comes to affordability, a word that the president mentioned again that he doesn't really like and thinks that it's a made-up word by Democrats. But when it comes to their ability to go to the supermarket and buy the things that they need, that their family needs, with food and medicine and you name it. They're having real struggles with that. A lot of voters are. And yet There was no acknowledgement of that from President Trump. No, I feel your pain, the way that Bill Clinton was so famously said years ago back in the 1990s. It was America is winning. America is winning like never before. We're going to keep on winning. And I just wonder if that was a smart approach. Maybe, maybe his base didn't need reassurance of those things, but the independent voters that you mentioned, the ones that will likely decide these midterm elections that are coming up in November, they really might have wanted to hear the president say, "Hey, I know that there are still problems out there, and this is what we're doing about it."
Right. And that was who he should have been speaking to. It's a tough position for the president, right? Because you really haven't made as much ground as you maybe are claiming to have made, or as maybe people see out in the real world on the economy. But you do have a midterm election coming up, and it's a midterm where we know Republicans are facing really strong headwinds in some of the seats they're running. We have 4 seats here in Georgia that are open. They're all GOP seats. And so a tough position for the president. You don't want to get up there and say, hey, it's not as good as we thought it was going to be, but hey, vote Republican in, the primaries. It's a tough thing to do. But certainly it doesn't matter because people are still feeling this pinch. And when the president was in Rome just a couple of weeks ago in that 14th district, he was saying, I beat affordability. It's not an issue anymore. Don't worry about it. Go ask any consumer and they'll tell you it is still very much an issue between rent prices, healthcare prices, grocery prices. The only time I heard the president say anything that was acknowledging things are still kind of in the weeds was when he said, we're working on beef prices. Just hang with us, bring it down a little bit. We're working on that. I wish, and I think a lot of people wish that he had done that on even more issues when we talk about housing prices, when we talk about the price of big goods like cars. I will talk about, of course, the cost of healthcare, especially in Georgia, where 1.4 million people just kicked out their ACA subsidies. I think people really wanted to hear a little bit more substance and maybe, to your point, a little bit more understanding that things are not exactly where they need to be. Realistically, do inflation numbers impact you on a day-to-day basis? Do job numbers impact you on a day-to-day basis? If you have a job, not really. And so I don't think that that was a wide appeal for the president. And you really heard it in the Democratic response to Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger saying, is the president working for you? He's not. He's working to enrich himself. Like you said, his base probably doesn't feel that way. Probably treat you Republicans, Democrats, or ought to be Democrats. But that independent middle vote that really, as you said, swings elections, they certainly wanted to hear more substance out of that speech instead of all the back patty that I think we heard.
I wonder, how much social media plays into the way that people received the president's speech the other night. Because while everyone might have been able to watch the same speech, they most likely went to very different algorithms on their social media feeds. We know that if you are a conservative voter, you are most likely getting a feed that is full of conservative viewpoints, people who are going to be in favor of what the president said and applaud the way that he said it. While if you are a liberal, a Democrat, and those are the sites that you typically go to, your algorithm is going to be completely different, and it's going to talk about how terrible the president's speech was and how he didn't address any of the problems that Americans are facing. And so, you see people walking away from this address, most likely in the same place that they were before the speech was delivered.
Yeah, I don't think in the course of history, State of the Unions have really swayed anyone's mind. There's been varying levels of bluntness with different presidents. You mentioned Bill Clinton, I believe back in 1994, gave his address, and it was, fairly straightforward. To my knowledge, Gerald Ford is the only one to get up there and say the State of the Union is not good, right? And of course, that was fairly obvious. We were coming out of Watergate, we were coming out of Vietnam War, things were really tough. But especially Trump, we know the showman he is. We know he's always going to play up to the things that he has done right. And so, yeah, I don't think the State of the Union is an equal for a ton of people. But for those independents, it was, I think, a chance for him to do the right thing by them and kind of acknowledge some of the things that, are making life difficult for people. Most of what I've seen on social media, as it always is every year when we have instances like this, is the back and forth between the Democrats and the president. I will note, too, that when we got a copy of that speech, when he had pointed to the Democrats and said, these people are crazy, that was a scripted lie. It was actually in his speech. And so there was definitely, some agitation. There was an element of that, I think, to this speech, certainly, when you look at the actual copy of it. you can see that there was definitely some campaigning going on with the president saying, Democrats are crazy. We don't want them in office. That was a clear message to me to say for a Republican in these primaries and when they're around. So yeah, I wouldn't put too much stock in the social media fallout if I were anyone. I would simply pay attention to how your life is going right now.
You mentioned Gerald Ford, who famously did not win another term after he made that declaration at the State of the Union address that the State of the Union was not good. So no surprise that we haven't heard other presidents mimic that approach because they want to win their elections, obviously. So
Going to add you recorded.
that's right. Okay, so here we are, and we're looking at what is becoming a shorter and shorter runway for the Republicans to be able to turn things around, not only with reality, but also with their messaging, and try to convince voters who are, as we've been discussing, still feeling the effects of the economy, and get them feeling a little bit better as they get set to head to the ballot box. Historically speaking, the party in power, the party that's in the White House, loses seats in midterm elections. That's the way it goes most of the time. But we could be looking at something that is a lot more like a bloodbath, a thumping, as George W. Bush mentioned after his party lost a lot of seats when during the midterm during one of his terms. It could be a really, really big night for the Democrats if the Republicans are not able to get it together. So what do they have to do?
Yeah, I mean, you see it again, just to raise that point. This is not uncommon to see these small to medium to even large swings in the balance of power in the House and Senate during midterms. No one, we're Americans. We always want more, right? And so there's always this dissatisfaction with the current administration. If people aren't making enough money, if people, don't have the amenities they need in life, whatever the case may be. We saw with the Obama administration, even when he had incredibly high approval ratings, there was that really bad midterm that they had where they lost control of the House and Senate. And it really stifled the Obama administration's ability to do things. And we could see that with the Trump administration if the midterms go the way we think they will. And we can look back, and we've talked about this 1,000 times, but it bears weight. The PSC elections here in Georgia, and that was a heavily Republican board. It had been for decades, in fact. And we saw two Democratic members overtake Republican challengers or incumbents in those races. We also saw a couple House districts here, one in Atkins that was reliably red, flip blue as well. And so, I think for Republicans, it is very much crunch time. They've really got to start messaging the right way. We're having Mike Collins, for example, on the show this weekend. He's up against a very tough incumbent in John Ossoff. And I think they're starting to feel the pinch a little bit. But I will note, too, that, to give Trump some credit, he has been able to circumvent Congress on a number of different days. Inside a lot of executive orders, he has been able to work razor-thin majorities in his favor, and it's like the big, beautiful bill over the summer, in instances like the government shutdown.
Right.
And so, I don't know if Trump is necessarily concerned about little swings. I think he's concerned about really big swings that would actually allow Democrats to have more power than just holding out on Republicans.
It's so interesting because the president is about to enter his lame duck phase, which is the term that's given to a president whose time in office is finite. He cannot run for another term. And so we know that these are the waning days of the Trump presidency. And when that's the case, you end up seeing a lot of times lawmakers in that president's party begin to distance themselves and not necessarily tote the line that the White House would like them to. And it'll be very interesting to see as we get closer to the primaries and these midterms in November, whether Republicans who have really stood by President Trump's side with good reason, whether that will change at all, whether we'll start to hear some dissenting voices like we did from Marjorie Taylor Greene before she announced her resignation from Congress. Might there be other Republicans who are in tough races who may decide that it's more important for them to talk to voters in a way that they really feel that they can connect with them, as opposed to the way that President Trump would like them to?
Right. And that's a tough line to walk, right? Because Trump is the de facto head of the Republican Party, not even de facto, he's just the head of the Republican Party. His, while his endorsement certainly is helpful, it is not the gold standard. It does not bear weight 100% of the time. We're seeing that in cases like Kelly Loeffler or Bushel Walker losing their Senate seats to Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff. So, I think it's safer than people might think if you're a Republican to break with the president, but nobody really seems to want to do that. And I think it's an important question for constituents to ask: how do you reconcile this difference between the president saying everything's fine and affordability is not an issue, and the way you're living your day-to-day life? Those are the questions that, of course, we and other constituents need to be asking these candidates to make sure that they are not just going to fall in line with policy that could be harmful to their own constituency. A good example is Marjorie Taylor Greene, like you mentioned, saying, yeah, I mean, Republicans don't like the ACA, but I got a lot of constituents that use the subsidies, including members of her own family.
That's right.
Of course, that led to that famous break. And so, while I don't think it'll be kind of a widespread effect, I do think that you will start to see some Republicans maybe back off just a little bit. Kind of an extreme example, but at the end of the first Trump administration, we had January 6th, where you had people like Lindsey Graham putting his hands up and saying, I'm out. That's it for me. And of course, they came right back and supported him in his second run. So, and whether or not it holds, I think you will start to see some Republicans maybe not outrightly distance themselves from Trump, but start to talk a little bit more about what we didn't hear at the State of the Union address, which was, we know it's tough, we're working on it. We got your backs type of thing. Barry Loudermilk was a very surprising instance of this, where he decided not to run for re-election in a district that, let's be real, he probably would have won any time he decided he wanted to run that race, and he's not doing it. And so, this is an interesting position for Republicans. We have 4 open seats here in Georgia, all EOP seats. And I think they just need to start messaging to their constituents instead of the president.
You mentioned the Congressman Loudermilk, who has dropped out. There are a record number of members of Congress, sitting members of Congress, who have announced either that they're not running or that they're running for other seats. We talked about the Public Service Commission elections here in Georgia, and I remember talking to our political experts and analysts at the time, asking, is this going to be a bellwether? Here it is, it's a race. These are seats that are typically not, marquee races that voters pay a lot of attention to. But in light of the fact that these were Republican seats that both flipped on the Public Service Commission, Democrats began to sort of, feel confident about themselves. You mentioned Mike Collins, who's going to be on the record with us this coming Sunday. Let's talk about that race against Senator Ossoff and some of the other races that we're facing here in Georgia, which could be bellwether races. Of course, we also have the special election for Marjorie Taylor Greene's seat in Georgia 14, where President Trump has made an endorsement in that race, endorsing Clay Fuller, who says that he is the guy who is going to be with President Trump 100% of the way. So no deviating for Clay Fuller at this point. But what happens if someone like Sean Harris, who is a retired brigadier general, a farmer in Northwest Georgia, someone who has run for that seat and lost previously to Marjorie Taylor Greene, but who seems to have some supporters on the ground there, even amongst some Republicans, if you believe him? What happens if this primary, this special election, rather, if voters go to the polls in Georgia 14, and we don't see the president's choice amongst the top couple of vote getters, or we see a Democrat squeaking by and getting in with the possibility of winning a contest and winning a seat that has been in Republican hands for a long time.
Yeah, I think there are actually 2 races that can be bellwethers here. It's actually not the Senate race, because Trump has not made an endorsement in that yet. And so we don't get to really test that unless he changes his mind and decides to do that before the primary. I think the 2 races you're going to want to look at, see how this goes, because we will have an indication before voters go to the polls in November, and we get to test 2 Trump endorsements, is that special election, right? We'll know that very soon, whether or not Clay Fuller and Donald Trump can hold enough, of the voters' trust and attention to actually get out of Clay Fuller.
March the 10th is that.
10th is coming up, and we'll know, that night, whether or not Trump's endorsement carries the gold standard in that race. But Yeah, Clay Fuller certainly has not been doing as well as you would think in some of these straw polls. Of course, they're not the most accurate thing in the world, but that's at these forums and these debates that we're having where these straw polls are being taken, that is kind of a good microcosm of the Republican base in those areas. And we're seeing candidates like Tom Gray and former state senator Colton Moore do really well in those straw polls, even finishing above Clay Fuller. And so that could be an indicator that, even just in that Republican primary, and of course, Sean Harris, the Democrat, will be on the ballot as well. So we'll get a good sense of what voters in that district are thinking, and thereby I think, how the Republican base feels about Trump's candidates and kind of the policies that ride on his coattails. So that's one I think it'll be interesting. And by the way, you mentioned Sean Harris and Republican support. It's interesting. We heard the one of the party chairs in the 14th district say she was not happy about the signs when you drive around Rome. You see Republicans for Harris signs. I've never seen that before. And so, I think that could be an interesting race, not only to tell if Trump's endorsement really matters in these things, but also if Republicans are losing ground in a place that was a really strong hold for them. The other race is actually the governor's race in that primary because Trump has made an endorsement in that race. It's Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, and that's going to be coming up soon as well. But there are a lot of strong candidates on that Republican side in the primary. You have the Attorney General, Chris Carr. You have Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. And then, of course, you have Burt Jones. And you have new entry, Rick Jackson, the healthcare billionaire who's really made a splash in this race when he was running.
I think I might have seen one of his campaign ads.
Yeah, one or two. Yeah. I'm sure you have. I'm sure everybody has. But, he's an interesting candidate strictly because he is also very much in that Trump vein. Now, Trump, of course, has endorsed Lieutenant Governor Jones. We were interested when we went out to Rome for that rally to see if the president might be a little soft on Jones in terms of maybe an indicator that he might want to switch his endorsement. And so his endorsement, he was not. He was full in on Burt Jones. Burt Jones has been a huge ally to the president here in Georgia. He has helped shepherd a lot of his federal policies through the state Senate at the state level, things like Department of the Doge Department for Government Efficiency. Jones led a version of that in the state Senate. We've seen a lot of income tax movement from Jones that, we know is something the president has encouraged state leaders to do as well. And so, I think if Burt Jones were to lose that primary or not do as well as he's expected to, that could be interesting as well because Trump has really stood behind Jones this entire time. And if you see a candidate like Brad Raffensperger or like Rick Jackson, best Burt Jones in that primary, that's going to be very telling for Republican voters too, that maybe the base is off of what the president has in mind for them.
And on the Democratic side, we should mention this week saw another Democrat drop out of the race, Roa Ruma, state lawmaker, or Rua Roma, pardon me. She announced that she is dropping out of this race in order to focus on another contest. But if we look at the Democrats, polls seem to show former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms as the front runner in that race. But Jason Estevez is still out there. He's got some money to spend. What's your take as we look at the Democratic field in this race for Georgia governor?
So it's no surprise to me at all that Keisha Lance Bottoms is leading these polls. She's very recently removed from Georgia politics as the mayor of Atlanta. She had a very tumultuous term there with all the things that went on kind of right before COVID and right during that very tough time for any elected official to navigate. So her name recognition is through the roof. Not surprised that people are going to these polls, looking at the list of candidates. Some people just vote with their eyes. That's what it is. And so I think certainly that Mayor Bottoms is playing to that and had really benefiting from that. People don't necessarily know folks like Jason Estevez unless you live in DeKalb County or you were around when he was labor commissioner. People don't necessarily know who Mike Thurmond is and all of the things that he's done for the Democratic Party and for Georgia. And so, and don't get me wrong, Keisha Lance Bottoms is an incredibly strong candidate. She's a savvy politician. She was fairly well liked when she was in office, and she's got great name recognition. So no surprise there. I think it's just going to come down to what happens with the runoff. Will she be able to get more than half of voters to approve her as the candidate? That's a tough thing to do in Georgia. And when you're talking I think it's at this point, just looking at polling numbers, it's going to be Keisha and it's going to be somebody else. It's just a question of who that other person is.
And if you talk about Keisha Lance Bottoms, who obviously has the name recognition, she also has some baggage. She did not run for another term, and a lot of people are wondering why she didn't do that. Some even calling her a quitter for having left after just one term as mayor in Atlanta. But then, of course, there were attempts that she made to try to join the the Biden administration, that she was really not able to get the job that she wanted. She did end up getting a sort of a low-level advisory job within the Biden administration, but her connections to Joe Biden would really open the door for any Republican who wins in the primary to just go after her, tying her to a presidency that a lot of people, even a lot of Democrats, now view as a failed one.
Yeah, it's tough because those are the things that voters pay attention to. They really do. It is an uphill battle for her in terms of opposition because she's had the most time as a politician. She served at, arguably, besides Mike Thurman being labor commissioner, she's served at the highest level for any of these Democratic candidates. And so you're getting a lot of exposure that also comes from a lot of baggage. People are very upset with the way that she handled COVID, and also some of the Sequoia Turner fallout when that young girl was killed in the early days of those protests after the killing of George Floyd. And so there is a lot to go after Keisha Lance Bottoms on, no question about it. If you serve as mayor, even for one term of Atlanta, you're going to accumulate a little bit of baggage. But certainly for her, she was there in a tough time. And there's a lot for Republicans to go after. But don't forget, besides Rick Jackson in that Republican side, there is a lot to go after with these other candidates as well, between Burt Jones, especially Brad Raffensperger. No matter how you feel about the way he handled the fallout of the 2020 election, there are a lot of Democrats who could say he could have done more. There are a lot of Republicans who said he could have done more just the opposite way.
Right. To help the president.
Exactly. And so everybody's got their baggage. It's going to be a very dirty primary. We've already seen the attack heads running within the GOP primary. It's been especially bruising. So I would say just buckle up because everyone's going to go after it.
Good advice. Well, we appreciate you watching and listening to us today. Of course, On the Record airs Sundays at 11 on Atlanta News First. You can also find it streaming anytime, anywhere on ANF Plus, which you can find on all of our streaming platforms. Again, Mike Collins coming up this weekend. We've got some great analysts who are going to come in and break it all down for us, and we'll continue the discussion as we head towards the special election in Georgia 14, the primaries, and then the general elections in November. A lot of politics to talk about, and we appreciate you joining us. We'll see you soon right here on ANF.
Thank you for watching ANF Plus. For more breaking news, live coverage, and your community stories, download the Atlanta News First app. You can also watch us on YouTube, Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV. To join the conversation on YouTube Live, visit our channel and hit subscribe. You can also listen to the Atlanta News First podcast by searching Atlanta News First on your preferred listening platform.